Welcome to the video lecture on SupertypeSubtype discriminators. This is a fairly simple topic. It's really, you have subtypes and supertypes, and what we're saying is that sometimes it makes sense for the supertype to actually have as one of its attributes a value that determines what subtype it's associated with, right? So you're gonna have a supertype, and then you're gonna give it an attribute, and that attribute is going to determine which of the subtypes that each of the instances of that supertype is associated with. Very, very common. If you have this, you can imagine you're going to need, most likely, some way of determining which supertype instance is associated with what subtype. So it's very, very common for the supertype to have an attribute to let the user know, or the person associated or that's in the process of using the database, what subtype this instance of the supertype entity is associated with. So in this case, we have disjoint and we have overlapping. So a disjoint, if you have a disjoint situation between the supertype and the subtype, it's a simple attribute with alternative values. If they're overlapping, you're going to need a composite attribute to let the user know any number of subtypes that this supertype instance is associated with. So let's take a look at this. So in this case, we've got employees, and employees are either hourly, salaried, or consultants. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add an attribute to the employee entity called employee type. So now each instance of an employee will have a type. And again, this is a disjoint rule. So now that employee type can only be three values. It's either going to be H to denote that this employee is an hourly employee. It's going to be S to indicate that this is a salaried employee, or it's going to be C to indicate that this is a consultant employee. Remember, this is a disjoint rule, so that means the employee has to be one of these, but not multiple of these. So moving right along, we get to the overlap rule, which means that the subtypes or the supertype instance can be more than one subtype, right? So it can either be manufactured or purchased. So now in this case, we have a composite attribute of the supertype called part type. And in this case, we're going to indicate whether it's manufactured or purchased, but it can be manufactured and purchased, right? So in this case, we're using a Boolean value for manufactured and purchased. So if it's manufactured, it's going to be a Y. If it's purchased, it's going to be a Y. So in a lot of the instances associated with the supertype part, we're going to have either manufactured or purchased, but there are going to be some where the manufactured is yes and the purchased is yes. And in that case, that would be overlapping. One more level, so here's a hierarchy of that. So now we've got a person who can either be an employee, an alumnus, and a student, right? Because now we're overlapping, right? So a person can be an employee, a person can be an alumnus, and a person can be a student all at the same time, but a person has to be one of them. Note the double line between person and the overlap. And then further down the hierarchy, we've got an employee, and if you're an employee, you have to be either a faculty or a staff. But in this case, it's disjoint. You can't be faculty and staff at the same time. Unfortunately, at Hofstra, that is not the case because I am both faculty and staff. And then we look at student, and in student, and again, we can have employees that are neither faculty or staff. Then we look at student, and a student has to be either a graduate student or an undergraduate student. Again, this is a disjoint rule, meaning that you can't be a graduate student and an undergraduate student simultaneously at the same time. And that ends my lecture on the supertype and subtype discriminators.